Hello there. Jorbs coming at you with another Spire side chat. Today I want to talk about Tantrum. This is actually one of the most unique and difficult to analyze watcher cards for me, like in my opinion. And so it's taken me quite a long time of playing the class and trying out different things and getting used to what's going on to feel like I have something I can confidently say about this. But I think I'm ready to say something. So, Tantrum. Deal 3 damage 3 times for 1 energy. You enter Wrath after you deal the damage, so Wrath doubles the damage that you deal, but you don't get the doubling on this damage, just on future damage. And you shuffle this card into your draw pile. The shuffle this card into your draw pile element of Tantrum is very unique, very different from what you see on other cards in Slay the Spire. There are some cards which give you more of the same thing on later turns, like Infinite Blades for Silent gives you a Shiv every single turn, or Watcher has some other cards like Study shuffles Insights into your draw pile, which you'll draw on later turns. But this idea of Tantrum being in your draw pile to draw again later on, and it's like the exact same card that you just played before, is pretty unique and pretty interesting. So immediately, one thing that this does is it makes it so that when you put one Tantrum in your deck, if you play that Tantrum, it ends up being a larger proportion of your deck than a different card would have been. So if I put one Wheel Kick in my deck, say, I play that once per cycle through my deck, probably, unless I were to recur it with a Meditate or something like that. But when I put a Tantrum in my deck, if I draw it when I play it, probably on average I'm looking at playing it more like 2 or 3 times every time I go through my deck, depending on the exact size of the deck and how much card draw I have and stuff like that. And so this card is significantly more impactful to what's going on in your deck than other attacks you can take. And one thing that that does is it lets Tantrum be very, very, very good at front-loading damage for you. Something that you're looking for in front-loaded damage is you're looking for a card that can get you through the fights where you really need front-loaded damage, mostly in the first half of the run. There are some in later parts of Slay the Spire, but mostly you need front-loaded damage in the first half of the run. And then you mostly want the card to like not get in the way that much as you're playing the boss gauntlet at the end of the run, where you're just usually not going to be able to front load enough damage to kill Time Eater anyway, so your front loaded damage cards stop doing that much. And Tantrum's really good for that, because instead of having 2 or 3 front loaded damage cards, you could have 1 Tantrum, and this card has a ton of damage on it, and you draw it multiple times as you go through your deck. So, great. Really cool card. Another thing that this card does, which is pretty interesting, is that it enters Wrath for you. And there aren't actually that many ways that Watcher has to enter Wrath in her kit. The way that Watcher works is that her starter deck has access to Wrath via Eruption. This is a starter card, and it can be upgraded to cost 1. And then, other than that, you've got Crescendo, which is a very bare bones sort of card, which can be used if you want to enable some stance switching types of synergies or really want to be able to enter Wrath on a particular turn. But my experience with Crescendo has been that typically you can get attacks which have Retain on them, and they tend to be better cards than Crescendo is. And so you pair the attacks with Retain with one of your Wrath sources, which doesn't have to have Retain, because your attacks can be waiting in your hand for when you draw the Wrath source. This is my like general feeling about Crescendo, and I don't pick that card terribly often. Other than that, there's Indignation, which is a way to apply Vulnerable to enemies, but this card's, for its mode where it enters Wrath, which is what it does if you're not in Wrath to begin with, it's very bad compared to the other options. It doesn't have the retain that Crescendo has. It doesn't deal 9 damage like Tantrum or Eruption deal. Because neither of the modes of indignation is particularly good, I haven't found it to be very valuable. And the vulnerable that it applies at the cost that you're paying for it, I've generally found that Crush Joints is a card that I'll often end up with in my deck in Act 1 anyway, and that this card is doing enough to apply vulnerable in the fights where I feel like I need that vulnerable. So I haven't loved Crescendo super much. I haven't loved Indignation super much. I've actually been very surprised with how much I like Simmering Fury. Simmering Fury in particular has performed incredibly well for me with Meditate. So I can start my turn in Wrath off Simmering Fury with an extra 2 cards, so a 7-card hand. And because I was in Calm at the end of my last turn, I get an extra 2 energy this turn from leaving Calm as well. And all of a sudden I have a big turn with Wrath, and then more than likely I'm going to be able to leave Wrath at the end of the turn if the fight is still going. So Simmering Fury has been great, and going like Meditate plus, getting back Simmering Fury and Meditate plus, and then doing the same thing the next turn has been something that's been very, very strong and successful for me recently. So Simmering Fury I would say is fine, and then other than that it's Tantrum. That's actually it. Because what happens in the Watch Your card pool is that Wrath is your Wrath is sort of presented as your early to mid game damage scaling, but then Divinity is what is generally more presented as your late game damage scaling. So you have cards like Devotion, which give you Mantra, and once you get 10 Mantra, you enter Divinity, and when you're in Divinity, you get 3 extra energy and you triple your damage. And so the reason that I haven't felt comfortable talking about this Wrath stuff really up until now is that working out how true is it that you really tend to need to go for this Divinity stuff toward the end of the game? Is it actually perhaps true that you can get by with just Wrath for damage scaling a lot of the time? Working that out took me a while, and the more experience I've had with playing with Tantrum and Simmering Fury, the more I've felt like there are a lot of runs with Watcher where you just don't really need to invest in this Divinity stuff at all. Divinity's a sort of weird thing because unless you're like using it via Blasphemy, which you can check out my Spireside chat on Blasphemy if you want to hear about this card, it's great, but it's not exactly a late game scaling engine or anything. It's more useful in the first 2/3 of the run. Can be okay at the end too. But unless you're using something like Blasphemy, often getting into Divinity is like fairly involved. Like you're going to need a couple of cards or a card and a relic, or maybe you have a worship and a meditate, so you're playing the worship multiple times. Some of the stuff takes quite a lot of work compared to like paying 1 energy, and not only are you in Wrath, but you also just dealt 9 damage. So, you know, we are, I mean, it's sort of like the front loading versus the scaling in mechanics. You're comparing front loading with Wrath versus scaling with Divinity. But my experience has actually been that a lot of the time Wrath is enough to win you an entire Ascension 20 run, including killing the heart. So, some of the reasons for that are that Simmering Fury and Tantrum are very powerful cards which you can recur quite often. Simmering Fury you can recur with Meditate, and it draws you extra cards, so it sort of enables drawing it again. And Tantrum shuffles itself into your draw pile again. Tantrum does great with Talk to the Hand, Tantrum does great with Strength, and Tantrum does pretty well, I would say, with Scry, which is a mechanic which can be paired quite nicely with Wrath type stuff, because Scry can make you a decent amount of block. Talk to the Hand plus Weave, for example, can make you a lot of block. And it all meshes together really nicely. So, I think over the past month of playing Watcher probably, I've gone from feeling like I needed to be switching into Divinity toward the end of runs to win, to more and more and more feeling like often the Wrath cards that I have available to me that are doing stuff straight away, like they're great in Act 2 against elites, for example, and I don't have to worry about having some bad Divinity card that doesn't do anything because I haven't found the rest of the support for entering Divinity yet. Yeah, these Wrath cards, more and more I'm finding, are good enough to win entire runs with. And so Tantrum for me right now is one of the cards I am most excited to see when I'm playing Watcher. And I'm expecting it to be played sort of as an engine enabler for me. When I'm picking up Tantrum, I'm looking for some ways to leave Wrath, because I know that I'm going to want to enter Wrath a lot. Like, whenever I draw Tantrum, ideally I'd like to enter Wrath with it. I'd like to play it and keep playing it. One of the big cards for me, for Tantrum specifically, has been Tranquility. Because Tantrum's something that you draw from your draw pile, and unless you have a huge amount of control over your draw pile with Scry, you're not necessarily going to get to choose which turn you draw Tantrum on. And so making sure that you have a card in hand that can get you out of Wrath helps ensure that you can actually use it for your damage, and Tranquility does exactly that. And not only does Tranquility get you out of Wrath, but also puts you in Calm, which means that when you draw Tantrum again, another turn or two from now, because it's been put back in your draw pile, you're going to get extra energy for that Wrath turn there. So I found that Tranquility pairs incredibly well with Tantrum. And Tranquility's, I mean, this is a common, you see commons all the time. The thing that it enables you to do as a common is, I would say, pretty impressive when you're pairing it specifically with Tantrum. I haven't found it to be as significantly great with other cards, but with Tantrum, yeah, absolutely. And can be fine in other situations too. Another card that I feel like I'm probably always going to mention whenever I'm talking about stances is going to be Meditate. It's worth pointing out, though, that Meditate isn't going to get your Tantrum back for you because it's going to be in your draw pile again a lot of the time. And so with Meditate, if you're using Tantrum, you're often going to want to pick up like a big damage card or a big block card for the next turn. And that's fine. You can use it for that instead. But Meditate's a little bit tougher to use because you can't use it to get your Tantrum, and so your engine's not working very well. And that's why I mentioned Simmering Fury earlier, because Meditate and Simmering Fury, I feel, are matching up really nicely for giving you big Wrath turns over and over again in a way that Tantrum doesn't quite fit in with Meditate for. Now you can use all of these cards in the same deck. There's no real reason not to. I've had actually a lot of success with Rushdown for enabling this, especially if you can pick one up upgraded somewhere. Taking the 1 energy off the front of getting this effect is very significant, I would say, and the card just feels really good to play with when you're throwing Tantrums around, especially. So, yes, Jorbs seal of approval. I think Tantrum's very, very good, and I think that at this point, playing Watcher, I'm actually struggling much more to work out how I meant to use something like Worship than I am in trying to work out how to use Tantrum, because it just feels like quite often I get a run where my Wrath stuff is working so well that it's just unclear why I would want cards that let me move toward Divinity as well. So, hope you enjoyed that. I hope you have some fun checking out Wrath in your Watcher runs. Do of course keep in mind that enemies will attack you for twice as much damage if you remain in Wrath. Something to look out for, but I think that's a lot of the fun for the Watcher for me right now, actually, is towing that line of like, am I going to go into Wrath this turn and maybe I take a little bit more damage next turn because I can't leave Wrath, or so on and so forth. That can be really cool. All right. Hope you enjoyed the chat, and I'll see you next time.